Hello, my name is Shane Larengo, and I love stories. Whether I write them, live them, listen to them, perform them, or talk about them, I was born for storytelling. Today, I want to welcome Cooper Braun, and he has the distinction of being the first person that I've interviewed in my Storyteller Stories series that I don't actually know, that I haven't met before in person and seen him perform stories. And so this is a fun experience for me. But I did look him up and found out that he was raised by granola eating coyotes without a television. And so I also had a very long period of time of my childhood without TV. And he is also a storytelling partner, cohort, collaborator with Rachel Ann Harding, who recommended that I interview him. And they do stories with spirit. And so, Cooper, welcome to
Thank you.
Storyteller Stories.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be here.
Thank you. And would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I live just outside of Boulder, Colorado. You'll often see Boulder on my bio because Lafayette, Colorado means nothing to anyone who isn't local. Um, I was raised in the county of Boulder. We moved a lot when I was a kid. But it is true. The first time we got a television in my house, I was 10. And I think in the entirety of my life, I have had a television that got actual reception for 1 year in college and 1 month where my parents bought the Olympics. So I grew up really without television. I'm culturally illiterate as far as any of my friends are concerned. I don't have any sort of cartoon references or what I was supposed to learn as a child. And I think you're going to ask this question very soon, but that's part of what actually led me to storytelling, is that my father loved stories, and I grew up on story records and cassette tapes was the entertainment medium of my childhood.
Very interesting. And was it all genres?
If you know the storyteller J. O'Callahan, is basically narrated my childhood for in all intents and purposes. I still have it. It's a 2-record set of recordings from the National Storytelling Festival in the late 80s or the early 90s. So it was mostly Jay and then sort of a smattering of others that my dad encountered.
Yeah. So why then do you tell stories? Because I think that leads us right into
So
there. And my first big question, because
yeah,
that's important for every storyteller.
um, I grew up. First of all, I grew up with the medium of storytelling, and then I have been reading folklore and mythology pretty much all my life. I've been playing Dungeons and Dragons since some moment that I can't actually remember. My college degree is in theater, sort of half and half acting and tech. And then when I got out of college, I realized that it's far easier and more steady employment to do technical theater, which is what I have done since college and is my day job. But at the University of Colorado, which is where I work, every year we host an event called the Conference on World Affairs, which is they gather, it's a week long, they gather, it's about 100 speakers who are musicians and politicians and journalists and think tank members, and they sort of figure out, okay, who do we want to put on what panels and make them argue about, and there's panels about art and panels about politics and culture and sort of the whole gamut. And Liz Weir, the Irish storyteller, was a friend from Ireland of one of the women who was one of the main producers of the Conference on World Affairs. And one year Moira called Liz and said, do you want to come to the conference? And Liz came and people loved her. And gradually Liz started inviting other storytellers, and there began to be a storytelling component to the Conference on World Affairs. And being as I was working it, I was also sort of integral to parts of it. And I always tried to make sure that I would go see storytelling, because it was always this moment of like, oh, right, I remember that. This is this thing from my childhood that I loved. And as part of that, Liz did this when she was there, which anybody that talked to her about storytelling is, she was in communication with our local story circle here in Boulder. And she would say, if you like this, here is a card. These people are in Boulder. They do it. Check them out. And I talked with Liz, and she handed me a card, and I eventually called, and I sort of joined our story circle in Boulder, and that was in 2013. And I very quickly figured out that I actually had a lot of the tools already. I have pretty extensive acting training. As part of being a theater tech, I have spoken to 2,000 people in my concert hall. Like, that's part of my job, is I tell them what to do. And so those parts, I had stage presence, and I had projection, and I had the ability to memorize, and I had this sort of skill set that I went, oh, it's not the same, but it's similar. And I sort of fell into it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I have found as being a storyteller is like helping people understand that it is a professional art.
Mm-hmm.
So when did that realization come to you? Because it seemed like your both experiences that you have of your introduction to storytelling were on a professional level.
Yeah. So I appreciate that there are plenty of people that for whom storytelling is a vocation.
Mm-hmm.
It is a thing they love to do. On the other hand, I work and live in the arts world, and I work and live with people that make their living being artists.
Mm-hmm.
My first introduction to story was via professional storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I began to perform, I realized very quickly that I do not greatly enjoy performing to children. Rachel Ann Harding, who is my, we like to say friend with creative benefits, because when we say partner, everybody assumes that we're in a relationship.
Okay.
And while we have a relationship, we both have people that we sleep in bed with, and it is but if you need someone to do preschool or elementary school, Rachel is your woman. She is an amazing teller to children as well as a teller to adults, but I am not that person. Right. I like high schoolers. I will tell to middle schoolers, but what I really want to tell to are adults. And as part of that, it was not strange for me that you would charge for a show. That's just theater. That's just art. And while there's plenty of open mics and places where you don't do that, but if I'm doing a formal show, of course that's a professional activity. And that's just sort of where my brain went with it. And then I sort of realized later that maybe that was progressive or different thinking than many people. Yeah. But that's how I sort of stumbled into that path.
So you talk about your background as an actor, as an introduction, and help you with the skills. But from my experience, like storytelling and acting are two very different animals. Mm-hmm. How did you like move in to understand the craft of storytelling, and how is it different?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I will say acting does, there's some of the tools, and I refer to the word tool. I have this belief somewhere, there's a giant Venn diagram of all of the arts and how they overlap. And you could say adherence to script and very strict costuming could be modern theater, but that also could be classical music, right? There's this very intense adherence to the score, and everybody wears tuxedos. Right. So that, to me, they're tools. And that the fourth wall is a tool. The fourth wall was invented in the 1850s when gaslighting got invented and installed in theaters, and suddenly for the first time in history, actors could not see the audience.
And clarify gaslighting for a modern audience. It means something different in context.
You take natural gas and you light it on fire and you put it in a little globe and it glows.
And you light a dark theater.
Exactly. And so to me, the concept of modern theater, where the actors pretend that the audience doesn't exist, where one of the things I love about storytelling is that we're all in the same room together, that we, even if I am doing a first-person story, I know that the audience is watching and I can talk to the audience directly. That fourth wall is a thing, that it's a tool, and it sometimes is a useful tool and sometimes it's not a useful tool. And so, but in the concept of tools, the ability to stand on stage, the ability to project, the ability to hold space, the ability to use your body are all useful. Those are all, it's one of the things I encounter with storytellers who have never performed in front of an audience in a theater, is suddenly they don't know how to use a microphone. They're used to speaking to a classroom. And so just the simple task of using a microphone is another tool or another skill. So I came in with a lot of those skills. However, storytelling is its own art. And I'm actually finding out in this moment that online storytelling is indeed its own art as well. Yes. It's similar, it's very similar, but it's different. And so there's definitely a learning curve with any of them. But I think in many ways I approached it in that, what works best for this? And I I like to talk. You know, we could joke, you know, everybody sort of says, when did you become a storyteller? And the sort of default is, well, I was always lying to my parents as a kid, right? Like humans tell stories. You know, the word
Right.
storyteller, as we both know, is
Mm-hmm.
sort of almost lost its meaning because novelists are storytellers and
Right.
film directors are storytellers. And storyteller is actually this word that we just mean as communicator.
Yeah.
And
And I
so
always try to make the distinction with lowercase storyteller is like, and then
that's a
uppercase
really good way.
storyteller.
That's a really good way to do it.
I'm an uppercase storyteller.
I will often say I'm a performance storyteller,
Hmm.
as a way to try to
I've
at
used
least
that too to try to
make someone's
identify.
brain say, "What does that mean?"
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
so
and yeah, you mentioned too about this new venue of online storytelling that we're very aware. It's not just like we're telling to an audience and being recorded, but
mhm,
we're telling to recording ourselves to tell to an audience.
mhm.
And you mentioned also like working with older teenagers and adults. So what would you say like your genre is that you prefer that
So
kind of
yeah, oh, absolutely.
mm-hmm,
So the vast majority of what I do is folk and fairy tale.
mm-hmm,
Adapted folk and fairy tale, if we want to drill down a little bit.
okay.
Janice Del Negro, who is a mentor of mine and an amazing storyteller out of Chicago, um, this is my favorite metaphor, which is that the way in which folk tales are gathered and recorded, often by middle and upper class men who are not part of the society that they're recording, um, it's like freeze dried soup.
Mm-hmm.
You can just pour hot water on it and you can eat your soup, which is the equivalent of reading the Brothers Grimm's verbatim. And sometimes it's good freeze dried soup, and sometimes it's very bland freeze dried soup, right?
Right.
Um, but
And
if you
sometimes you're hungry, and
right,
so you'll eat anything.
you'll eat anything. But if you want to make it, you can make your own broth. You can look at all of the ingredients in the freeze dried soup and you can say, okay, there's carrots. So let's go get fresh carrots and cut those up. And there are peas. So let's get fresh peas. And you can expound the metaphor as far as you want to take it.
Right.
But you can add and you can play. And there are definitely stories that I do that are as close to the original as possible because I think the original is fascinating and it's a story no one has ever heard before. And there
Mm-hmm.
are versions of stories that I do. I have a Snow White that is set during the Silver Rush in Colorado, and it does a little bit a love letter to my state. And we have an imported fairy here. The Tommyknocker, which is a Cornish fairy originally, is a Colorado fairy. It's been very much embraced, and the concept and the stories of them were brought over from the miners from Cornwall. And so it is my homage to them and to that world. And so they're adapted levels. I do very little that might be considered fractured fairy tale. I like to stay within the constraints of many of the pieces that I'm working with, but folk and fairy tale is most of what I do. I do a little bit of slams telling. If you've looked at me on YouTube, you've
Too,
probably
yeah.
found my pieces from Truth Be Told because they do very good video, and I'm very happy that there's good video. Uh, Story slam to me feels like a sonnet. It's a very, very strict form.
Mm-hmm.
There are very intense rules to the form. 5 minutes, true or ostensibly true. There are people that are very, very good at the form, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm really bad at writing sonnets. Is the metaphor, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't like the constraints of the form, and while I can write a sonnet to push myself and play, it's not my preferred form. I've branched out just a little bit recently into, and I think you'll have a question at some point about the Texas Storytelling Festival, where I premiered this piece, which is mythic realism of the blending of fantasy and reality. So I have one piece that's people have really liked in that world. Most of my audience is adults. I like to say that I curate fairy tales and folk tales for adults. And that often doesn't mean they are rated R. It means that my language choice and the way in which I approach them is for an adult audience. Most of the stories, I welcome children to the shows, but they're not my target audience.
Right.
Now, there is the show that Anne and I are doing right now with the Boulder Fringe Festival is a PG-13 rated show. It's a pretty intense show, and so we don't want really little ones there.
Right. Well, you mentioned Janice Del Negro as one of your mentors. Do you have other mentors that you want to highlight?
Yeah.
And then like also how then have you learned to mentor others?
Excellent. So the person that maybe gave me immediate, there are I've been helped by many people in the Colorado community. The person, though, that gave me really intense initial direction is an Irish storyteller currently living in England. Come on, Cooper. Her name is on the tip of my brain. Oh my God, this is embarrassing. I'm so sorry.
We can come back to it.
Good Lord, Cooper. This is ridiculous. I'm so sorry. We'll come back to that. So among those that have sort of helped me in the recent years, Janice Del Negro in Chicago and Laura Packer, who is, I believe, in the Minneapolis area right now, are my two sort of people of a generation above me who have sort of helped me along and given me guidance, both of whom do really incredible things with fairy tale and play with fairy tale in ways that many people haven't. Yeah. And so Laura and I communicate pretty regularly, Janice a little less so, but they really are sort of guiding forces in this world. And Laura specifically of, you don't have to tell the children, that there's a lot of the storytelling tradition where for a lot of the 80s and 90s, the telling to children was where the money was. It was what a storyteller did. And the idea that you don't have to tell the children, you can tell to adults, is a little bit revolutionary, and blew my mind a little bit when I said, no, I can just accept that. That's what I can do.
Well, and I'm already excited that I do have a recorded interview with Laura that's already released.
Yes,
so,
I actually I had seen it before you had emailed me, and I went, yes, I know that name.
Yeah, the very first time I ever heard Laura Packer tell, I was just, my mind was just like, whoa, because I don't tell traditional stories. And so like listening to how she made that real to me, and did that process that you're talking about it wasn't some elitist, white man version. Right. I really loved about it. Yeah. So where do you find your stories?
Excellent. And let me go back. Claire Murphy.
I was picturing her in my mind. That's who you were talking about, but I couldn't. Yeah.
Claire also told at the conference on world affairs, I think I had been telling for just about a year when she told the conference on world affairs, she tells, if you ever have the chance, she tells a piece called The King of Lies. It is adapted from a book called Damascus Nights, which is why she has not publicized a recording of it, because her agreement with the author is she is allowed to tell it publicly, but she's not allowed to publish a recording. I can literally say that watching that show changed the trajectory of my life. That it's a piece of art that I said, you can do that? Like, it is one of the most incredible experiences of my life to see the show. And afterwards I said, can I please buy you coffee? Yes. And in about an hour over coffee, she gave me a really interesting, welcome to storytelling. Things to think about. Just this incredible, masterclass in an hour. And
she was supposed to be a featured teller at the Texas Storytelling Festival one year, and something happened and she couldn't make it. But I watched her online as prepping to watch people. I have to do my homework before I can watch people sometimes, that I know about. But I can't wait for the opportunity to see Claire Murphy.
Claire is just one of the most incredible tellers. So where do I find stories? I read a lot of folktales. I read a lot, and the short answer is there are more stories to tell than I have time to tell, and I have what I call the Rolodex, though enough people have asked me, do you really have a Rolodex? The caveat here, I've only had a smartphone since last November. I'm a little bit of a Luddite, and so there are some of my friends that actually assume that I do, in fact, have a legitimate Rolodex. The Rolodex is actually just a Google document where I have sort of a running, these are the stories that I tell and their themes, and here's stuff that I want to tell. So I have a running list, and as those ideas pop into my head that you think, oh, that's a fascinating idea, or you hear a story and you love it. But
what hits you and makes you put that on your Google document and to say, this is a story I want to tell? How do you, what sense do you have that the feeling is it's right for you or right for the audiences?
Right. So there is, I don't know how to intellectually express it, but there are and there are times I read a story and I say, wow, I like it. There's some, and again, it's freeze-dried soup, right? In a lot of these, they're 200 years old. But there's something in it that I say, oh, that could be about that. One of my very early, very successful stories is, if you know the Brothers Grimm's, there's a piece that in the second edition is called Bearskin. In the initial edition is called The Devil in the Green Coat. And there are all of these Brothers Grimm stories that begin with, once upon a time, there was a soldier who was out of work. And Bearskin is a story about PTSD. It's a story about a man who makes a deal with the devil to wear the devil's coat for 7 years, and in that time to not wash his hands or his face, cut his nails or his hair, and to not pray for his own soul. And the assumption is he will kill himself. And if he's alive at the end of 7 years, the devil will clean him up and set him up for life. And it's one of these stories that I read and I went, oh, like, of course that's what this is about.
Oh my gosh, I just got chills.
Anytime that I've heard that story, it's sort of this weird folky story. And I'm like, no, there's all this stuff in there. And so it's often that. It's that moment of, oh, maybe that's what this story is about. Sometimes it's beauty. Sometimes it's something, there's a story that I love called Kathleen and the Greyhound Husband, which solves what I consider the east of the sun, west of the moon problem. There are all of these stories, the Cupid and Psyche story, east of the sun, west of the moon, the Black Bull of Norway, which is basically a girl gets married to a creature, a polar bear, a bull, a monster who she cannot see in Cupid and Psyche. And the rule is she must do a thing. And eventually her sisters usually convince her not to do the thing, and she sees, actually, he's a stunningly handsome man, but she's broken the spell, and he has to leave, and she goes usually on 7 years of trials, and eventually finds him. He doesn't remember her. He's going to be wed to an ogress or a princess or something, and she gets him back. And Kathleen and the Greyhound Husband or the Three Daughters of King O'Hara, I think, in the 1880 collection of it, is the first time that I encountered this story where it is not her fault. This isn't a story about you were bad and must do penance for something that you knew nothing about. And then the second part of that story is when she finds him, traditionally in that she has 3 treasures that she's gathered, and over 3 nights she exchanges a treasure for a night in his bed, though the princess or the ogress drugs him so he can't wake up. And this is the first version of the story where she can't wake him up, so she writes him a letter. Like, it was just like, thank you, whoever, whatever woman in 1880 that was adapting this story was like, this is stupid. And suddenly it hooked me in this way that I was like, those stories are beautiful. They're these amazing adventure stories. But the core concept of you must be punished for breaking a rule you didn't know about, I haven't liked. And so it's often a hook like that. It's something that grabs me and says, oh, I can play with that, or I can. And I mean, on the other hand, sometimes it's Anne and I do a show every year at a spice shop here in Boulder. It may not be the best show, but it's the best smelling show you've ever been to. It's an incredible show, and for that, it's all stories. It's spices and food, and so we've pretty much gone through as much of the folklore index as we can find concerning stories of food, salt, spices. And so sometimes it's like, great, this is another food story. That's the story I'm telling. And sometimes they work great. And sometimes you're like, I'll have told that once.
Yeah. So how do you make those stories your own when you are looking at a historical text?
Yeah. So I think, to me, and there's like, this is one of those things I'm like, you could do a whole workshop on this, right? There's a workshop somewhere in this. To me, it's about solving the story. And what I mean for that is, so Cinderella, the very classic Grimm Cinderella, includes this scene where her stepmother is already there. Her stepmother has basically made the girl into a slave. And her father comes and summons all 3 daughters and says, I'm going on a trip. What would you like me to bring you? And the 2 eldest stepdaughters say, gold and jewels and dresses. And Cinderella, who's in rags, says, bring me a twig from the first tree that knocks the hat off your head. And he just like rides away and does it. And to me, this is, and yes, within historical context, I get why this might rise. But to me, for a modern audience, I think that is the weirdest moment. And there's this whole question to me of what is her relationship to her father? That if her father has effectively abandoned her. And so that question to me is how do I solve that? In the same way of how do we solve the fact that the prince doesn't recognize her for 3 consecutive nights at a party?
Mm-hmm.
And then doesn't recognize he has to fit a shoe on her foot. I have a whole story that I've done called The True Confessions of Prince Charming, which is Cinderella from the prince's perspective, or who names their son Charming? My parents, that's who. But answering, who is this prince? Why doesn't he recognize her? What is this, And so for me, it's often finding that point where I get caught up.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, that doesn't make any sense. Why wouldn't she have just written him a letter? Right? Like those moments that I hiccup, and then I say, okay, what can I do with it?
Go ahead.
And the one other one that I would say is sometimes there are stories that I find that are stunning and beautiful, but no one knows about. And so in those cases, I often don't want to change them. Maybe I'll massage it just a little bit, but I want to bring it as much whole cloth from the past as possible, because I don't want this to be an adaptation of something that no one knows about. I don't want the first time they hear the story, if they go and find the original, they're like, oh, he changed all sorts of things. I sort of want to bring it as much whole cloth from the past because I think it's beautiful and I want people
it's not part of the canon yet.
Right. Like I want people to hear it. And so there are those stories too, where I'm like, oh, I just need to tell this because no one's heard it.
Yeah, I love that. So at this point of your story selection and adaptation and deciding how to tell it, how much are you considering your audience at this point? Or is it still very personal expression that's going on now?
So I think the short of this is that I have a pretty good sense of who my core audience is. And my core audience is generally my core audience because they're interested in the kind of storytelling I do. This is something I found actually very interesting, that whenever Anne and I produce events in Boulder that, someone's traveling through and, we're doing a house concert or something for someone, invariably I will get an email that says, are you and Anne telling? To say, they're really interested in hearing us tell. It's less about storytelling as a form, and it's more they have become our audience members, which has been one of the things that has been so amazing as part of the Zoom world and online storytelling now, is that these are people that are interested in hearing me tell, which is so cool. But so part of that is to say my audience is a little bit of self-selecting. People hear me and they're like, I don't like what he tells, so they don't come back. I definitely there's a little bit that I generally create stories in a way that they're the kind of stories I want to hear. And then I hope other people want to hear them too, which isn't to say that I don't, I sort of, actually, Elizabeth Ellis is the catalog that I use. Her ha-ha, aha, ah, and amen form of breaking stories down of sort of how they hit you is, I saw her do a work. She did a keynote for the Rocky Mountain Storytelling Organization just about a year after I'd started telling. And it was one of 2 workshops that I'd been in that was just like everything I needed at that moment was given to me.
Yes.
And that sort of breakdown of stories. And so there are certainly times that I'll say, oh, this is what this event is people want funny stories. They want aha stories, or this is a really deep event. And I try to do my publicity in such a way that people are knowing what they're getting into.
Yeah.
So that they don't come in expecting funny and they get hit with real intense stuff.
Something heavy. Yeah, definitely.
I like people to know they're in the right room.
Yeah. So how do you practice your stories to get them ready for an audience?
The joke that I will say is that I wander around the living room and scare the cats. This is maybe changing as of last week. So the vast majority of my stories I develop in my mouth. I think about and I will outline them and I will write down notes, but pretty much I develop them by just doing it. And I stumble through it a couple of times and it finds a form. And as I do it, I say, oh, I really like that line. We'll use that line. And generally, Once I've got something I like, I will tell it, I will record it, and then I will transcribe off the recording. The 2 stories that I am doing for the Fringe Festival show that Anne and I are in the middle of right now, both of those I wrote before learning. I've only done that with one other story, which is actually the Prince Charming story, because in that I had set myself 2 challenges, which was to write a first-person fairy tale, or a classic fairy tale, but telling it from first person, and to write it first and read it and learn it from the page. But so these last 2 are the first time in years that I have first written and then I've learned from the page. But generally, I either by writing or stumbling through it in my living room, I get a sense of it, and then I do it over and over and over and play with it until it sort of finds a shape. Sometimes that's really easy. Sometimes it's terrible.
How does that differ when you do the personal stories that you perform?
Same way.
Same way.
Yep.
Okay.
It's the same. Slam stories, I have to play it a little bit more with time. So there's a lot more of like, set the timer, tell the story. Okay, I'm 30 seconds over. What can I cut? That sort of, there's a little bit more of that aspect in it, but it's the same process.
Oh my gosh. You just gave me the most brilliant idea for when I do those time limit stories that always like terrify me, is set a countdown timer. And as I practice it aloud, because they're stories that I know, you know, like I don't need to write down, but that's the worst part of it for me to get it to 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. This
is one of those things that I don't know why I first did this. I mean, there's, if you want to pick a reason, Jewish, German, Virgo, I like a good list. I have always generally timed my stories. To me, it's a, you know, the Fringe show that I'm doing right now with Anne, we get an hour. And if it was an in-person Fringe show, pretty much at an hour, they turn on the lights and they kick you out. Like, there are hard lines. And so when I talk to storytellers and I'm like, how long is the piece? And they just sort of shrug. I'm like, what do you mean you don't know how long the piece is? And so and just in like, when I'm structuring a show, I like to, okay, we're going to have 45 minutes and then we're going to have an intermission. Then we're going to have another 45 minutes. I like, and again, sometimes it's, 10 to 12 minutes, but I like to have a sense of how long each piece is. And then you get to that moment, they're like, you have 10 minutes. Okay. I know the story is 9 minutes long. So yeah, countdown timer is your friend. Yeah. And do you have any advice for people who are wanting to get into storytelling, whether it be the personal thing that we see a lot of right now, or traditional storytelling, who have like the stage fright or the nerves about getting up and speaking in front of people? The problem is that, to me, it's actually 2 different issues. One is like just the memorization. Is you get people who, they can talk. We all know that person who, that you love their stories at a party, and in many ways, you hear that same story enough times, and you're like, you have that. You may not think of it as a set story, but the way you tell it, it doesn't vary that much. You hear the same jokes over and over. But many of us, since high school, really, when we were forced to learn a little Shakespeare, or the Gettysburg Address, or whatever it is that we had to, recite, haven't been forced to learn material. So there, on the one side, there is the actual crafting of a story, of how do I say the thing I want to say in, let's take slam for a moment. How do I say the thing I want to say in 5 minutes? Like, how do I do that? How do I craft the story? And then the other side is the standing in front of people, which is, and so to me, they're 2 things.
I see those.
Do
the standing in front of people one.
Great. The standing in front of people one. Much like the other one, the answer is do it. There's many YouTube videos. There's a lot online you could find. There's many books that have been written about this, about that. If it's a really big deal, the organization that I would point people at is the Toastmasters Organization. Who sort of, that's their whole goal, right? Their whole stated goal is allowing people to feel comfortable giving presentations at work, or like, that's a lot of that's where that organization started, was we have people that and especially people for whom English is a second language, who have to give a presentation at work and they feel terrified. And so the short answer is there are places to learn that.
Yeah.
Toastmasters is the one that I would direct people to. Basically the other one is anywhere that you can do it. And lower stakes is better. Open mics where people don't know you, especially if you're going to an open mic for the first time, don't invite all of your friends and family, or invite your spouse if you know they're really supportive of you. But in a place where, if you can find a place that the stakes are low, where none of those people know you, if story circles, this is one of the reasons I love story circles, because at least the ones that I host and the ones I've been to, I suggest I have done it where I'm like, I've never told this story before. I'm going to stumble through it. And everybody cheers at the end, right? Don't ask for feedback, especially at that level. Don't ask people for feedback. Just use it as a place to get up and tell. I have one very odd caveat, and this may categorize me as coming from Colorado, where we're maybe a little more liberal. If you as a storyteller, if you're someone who is a little bit farther along, but you're moving from smaller groups to larger groups, my suggestion is this: drink 2 beers or whatever it will take to get you just a little tipsy, and then perform again in a relatively safe environment. Because the feeling of adrenaline hitting you, especially upon seeing a much bigger audience than you're used to, is very similar to the effects of a couple of drinks. You don't have quite the same motor control. Your memory is just a little bit off. You have to overthink things just a little bit. And as much as to say, I think it's actually if you are the kind of person that enjoys a little alcohol, having a couple of drinks and feeling that unsteadiness and planting your feet. I remember a show that I did. I talk a lot with my hands, as you can notice. I held my hand out and I watched my hand vibrate, and I didn't think I was nervous, but my body did.
Oh yeah.
And so it's how do you relax through those feelings? Now, I would not suggest performing with alcohol in your system. You owe it to your audience to be good. But rehearsing with a select audience, a little bit of drinking, I think, can go a long way.
A long way. I love that.
But the short answer is do it. People get scared, so they don't do it, and then they get up where the thing really matters and they feel nervous. And so the short answer is do it. Try to create environments where the stakes are low. And if that means getting your friends and family together because you feel safe with them, or doing it where you have no friends and family because you don't want them to see you, you don't want to feel judged by your friends and family, find a place that you feel safe.
Yeah. Well, what other benefits do you see as being part of a story circle like you talked about, or a guild or group or organization community?
Great. And all of those words can maybe mean the same things, and often they don't.
Right.
So when I talk about story circle, there's one that has been running in Boulder for over 8 years now. Anne and I were given it. The woman who ran it, an amazing woman named Suzanne, just about 7 months after I joined, was moving to Austria with her husband. And she said, "You two, you're in charge now." And we went, okay. But the story circle at our height, we were probably gathering about 15 to 20 people once a month. We've certainly had ones where there have been 3 people, where we spend at most 2 hours, and you get to tell for about 10 minutes. We ask for about 10 minutes, though you're allowed, if there are not enough people, to say, I'm really interested in doing a 30-minute story. And then we had someone who signed up for a 10-minute slot who went 45 minutes, and we were like, oh my God, not what we expected again. But having an environment where you know the people, where the stakes are low, where we have professional tellers who tell at a very high caliber, but we're in a back room at a coffee shop, or there was a back room at a grocery store that they offer up for community events where we did it for many years. Wherever we are, it's low stakes. It's people that want to see you succeed. It's people who I've grown close to. They've come to my shows. I go to their shows. We support each other. Having that close-knit support, I find, is the most important thing. Likewise, this is one of the things that Anne and I discovered sort of by accident, but if you are doing this professionally, either doing it alongside someone, Anne and I we very rarely co-tell the same story, but 2 hours of performance is much easier if each person only has to do an hour, and we are accountable to one another. She's an optimist. I could be called a pessimist. We keep each other level. We support each other. Many storytellers I know have much smaller groups of other professionals they can bounce ideas off of. But having a community to support you in what is fundamentally a solo art is, to me, hugely beneficial.
Yeah.
And also just somewhere that you can rehearse in front of people who aren't paying, who are there to see you succeed, is hugely powerful.
So in addition to the Boulder Story Circle, what other associations do you belong to?
So I'm a member of the Boulder Story Circle. I was for a long time a member of the Golden Story Circle, which is another sort of suburb of Denver. There's also another organization called Northern Colorado Storytellers. I made it a point for about 1.5 years to go to every single story circle that I could in the area. And again, it was places that I could just rep stories. I could do it in front of audiences that were there to support me. I am the vice president of Rocky Mountain Storytelling, which is the Colorado chapter of the National Storytelling Network. And then I am a member of the National Storytelling Network, and I believe they have now split officially, Artists Standing Strong Together, AST, or ASSIST, depending on your pronunciation, is an organization that started just at the beginning of the pandemic to support storytellers who are out of work, community building. They have officially split off of the National Storytelling Network, and so I am on a committee there. So all that said, I am members of many of the storytelling organizations.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah. And I'm familiar with both of them, but I didn't understand the distinction. So I appreciate that too. Tell me what story that you always look for an opportunity to tell, the one that bubbles up or resonates with you the most.
See, it's funny. And when you sent me some of these to prelude, I was like, part of this is that, and maybe this should have said this when I was talking about what kind of stories I tell. A lot of what I tell is long form. It's hard for me to do a story in less than 12 minutes. And there's a lot of places that 5 or 8, like that's what they want. I'm like, but there's more. So I do a lot. There's a fair number of my pieces that are between 12 and 16. And then I have a solid number of pieces that are between 20 and 30. And so all of those over 20 and 30 pieces, I deeply, deeply love. But they're hard to pull out of your back pocket. Anytime I tell them I have to give myself a couple of days to sort of get it back in myself.
Right.
Just because it's hard to back pocket that. The story that so there are 2 that I'll talk about. One of these stories, I don't know if you've ever had this, whether it's writing, and I'm sure everybody has it in some art form, writing, painting, poetry, storytelling, where you just get given a piece whole cloth. And whether we want to call that the muses or God or spirit or just your own brain, like whatever, I've fought with pieces. Some of my favorite stories I've ever told were wars. It took so long even to speak them the first time that developing them was so hard. So I have this piece called The Last Confession, which is about, the ending of the Camelot story is Arthur and Bedivere on the beach and the Excalibur being thrown into the water. And so I have reframed this story about at the end of especially Mallory's Arthur, pretty much everybody goes off to convents and monasteries at the end of the wars. But it is about the last confession of Bedivere as he dies in a monastery. And it is one of those stories that the first time I spoke it just came out of my mouth. And it's pretty much been exactly that way ever since. It's the kind of story that I sort of just have to get out of the way of. Like, something says, say it. And it comes out. And it's like I'm getting a little bit of chills thinking about it. one of my absolutely favorite pieces I tell. And so that's one I deeply love. The story that I probably tell the most, and this is, there's a number of sort of arts organizations around town. There's a lot of the poetry community that are good friends of mine. And so someone will say, come to my poetry slam, tell a story. Like, we don't care. You have 5 minutes. Like, just do what you do. And so the piece that I often tell is The Storyteller and the Samurai, which is a Japanese piece about really about the importance of storytelling, and is probably my most like 5-minute, this is what storytelling means, here you go, kind of piece that I back pocket and just will pull out sort of anywhere.
Well,
so those are the two.
We got 5 minutes. You want to throw it at us? Oh, Cooper. Okay. Oh, okay, hold on.
Sure.
Wait. You froze. Are you hearing any technical difficulties with me?
I'm seeing a little lag on your side.
Okay.
I am not seeing. I seem fine to myself, but that doesn't mean anything in the world of Zoom.
Well, let's go with that. Hopefully, like, the technology gods will bless us. So
great. Do we want to do that now? Do we want to do that at the end? Or do we want to fit that?
I kind of want to hear it now.
Great, let's do it now. Give me a moment to adjust my screen setups and back myself up just a little bit. In this world of Zoom, one of the things that I found is I do talk with my hands, and so I have to push myself back from my computer a little bit. And let me see if I need to adjust the camera. All right, that will do all right. Let me play. There we go. There we go. Excellent. Sip of water.
Thank you.
Absolutely. In this strange world of COVID, there are a number of fires burning in Colorado right now, so we're all just coughing a little bit, and everybody's sort of freaking out because coughing is dangerous right now. Once, long ago in Japan, an old storyteller made his way along the road. His kimono was stained with the dust of his travels. His sandals were caked in mud. And as he saw the sun set, he felt the cold begin to wrap itself around him, sink into his old bones. But he smiled. For there, silhouetted in the setting sun, he saw a dojo, a school of swordsmanship to which young samurai might come and apprentice with a great master. And in those days, there was a tradition that any traveler appearing at the gates of a dojo come sundown might challenge a student there, and in exchange be given a bowl of rice and his place to sleep. The old man knocked on the gates, and they were opened by a young student. Grandfather, welcome in. The old man looked up at the student. Boy, you forget yourself. I am here to challenge the master of your school, so that I may have my place by your fire and my bowl of rice. The young man smiled. Grandfather, perhaps it is different where you come from, but here, you need only cross wooden swords with me, a first-year student, merely to show your respect for the house, and you will be given all you need. Boy, I am a master of my art. I do not cross swords with first-year students. Call your master. Grandfather, I beg you. When our master fights, he fights with sharpened steel, and he leaves corpses upon the ground. Boy, do you have wax in your ears, or are you just stupid? I have challenged your master, and if he does not meet my challenge, why? I will decry this house and all its students as cowards in all my travels, and I travel many places. The young man did not know what to do. He showed the old man into the courtyard, and then he ran to his master's chambers. There he bowed. Master, there is an old man at the gates. He would challenge you for a bowl of rice and a place to sleep. He doesn't even wear a sword. His hands, they tremble. And when the master samurai had heard his student, then his challenge will be met, for I will not refuse a challenge. He rose. He took his long sword, his katana, from its place of honor. He slipped it into the obi about his waist, and he began to walk through the halls of his school. As he did, his students saw him, and they saw that sword, and they knew what it meant. And by the time he reached the courtyard, it was lined with his students. And there, by the fountain, sat the old man, washing the dust of the road from off his hands and his face. Old man, I am told you challenge me, and I am here to accept your challenge. You do not wear a sword. One will be provided for you. And a senior student drew his own sword from out his obi and handed it to the old man, who took it. Ah, good. I was wondering when you would arrive. The old man stepped forward. He took that trembling hand and placed it on the sword. Are you ready? The master samurai paused for just a moment. But he took his stance. He placed his hand upon his sword, and he took one step forward. But as he did, the old man held up two fingers. Once, long ago, across the sea, at the edge of a cliff, sat the house with a red door, and before the door of that house sat a girl with hair as black as midnight and eyes like falling stars. The master samurai stepped back. He took his hand from off his sword, and he bowed deeply to the old man. He turned to leave, but his students began to whisper among each other, what was that? What did we just see? Our master surrendered without even drawing his sword. And the master samurai turned back. My students, you whisper, but I hear. Have I not told you each, time and time and time again, that to be a warrior, a man must be present in every moment of battle? This old man, he showed me sights I have not seen. He took me to a place I have not been. And yet he brought me safely home again. And in the space of that time, with but a flick of his wrist, he could have cut me down. And for that gift, for the gift of my life, which I now owe to him, he shall sit in my place at supper tonight. He shall sleep in my bed while I fast, and I meditate on the ashes of the fire, on what he has given me today. And so it was, and so it will be, for all those that tell stories, and all those who have the heart to listen.
Wow.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Cooper. And this is something that really hits home and that we talk about. You talk about workshopping and stuff, is that when people do tell difficult stories about landing somebody safely upon their return. And so how, I don't know, so this is a two-part question about how do you see what we're going through globally with the social unrest, with the pandemic, all of those things. And I don't want to go into details, but there's a lot of strife going on in our world today. And a lot of it could be solved, in my opinion, if we would just shut up and listen to each other's experience. So what do you see coming out of this period of time as far as stories are concerned?
So my opinion, and I think there are many ways to approach this. The way I have started, because again, the style of performance that I do is fundamentally it is entertainment. Sometimes the entertainment is heavy, but so are plenty of movies, so is much music, right? Like entertainment can be many things. Fundamentally, what I do is I am an entertainer. But that being said, the kind of stories, whether people want it or not, that I think people are hungry for right now are really deep. They want darkness. One of the things that we love about fairy tales except for the very rare occasion, in the end, things are better. And the storyteller has walked this path before. They are a guide through the dark woods, as it were, right? They are someone that has walked this path, and they will lead you to safety. And one of the things that, whatever darkness, there is resolution at the end. And I think that is really heavy stories are actually really powerful at this time, because what we want is we want reassurance. I think that, you know, there's plenty there are many directions we could go in the world right now, but one of the things that seems very apparent is many people are scared, and that hearing people and hearing what they're scared of, and legitimately as audience members hearing that is really, really powerful. That the ability to hear someone's story and to receive that story is really powerful. And I think this I think is the power of most of the slam community, of most of the modern personal storytelling movement, is that we as a society are really starved for empathy. And that within the constraints of that, hopefully, if it works right, it is a place where empathy is provided. It is a place where we can be empathic for strangers, and that's a skill that is less used than many people would like to give credit to, right? That the listening of someone's stories and acknowledging them as a human being with faults and failures is really powerful, and is not, you know, the news cycle is really built on fear mongering. It's really built on a thing is happening, you should have feelings about it, but it doesn't help resolve it. And so I think that stories are really powerful, and that the listening to people who are really different from you, and even if it hurts, like taking it that what they have to say, you may have been involved, like that they're like legitimately hearing what someone has to say is really powerful.
I agree. And I see like us as storytellers having to adapt by going online also opens us up to as storytellers and listeners both to connect with people that we normally wouldn't geographically get to do. And so that's amazing too.
I have a woman who, Rachel Ann, I'm sure she talked about it when she talked about it with you. She produces an amazing podcast called the Story Podcast.
Yes.
And one of her fans from that is in the Philippines, and she has been to a number of our shows. They're at like 9 or 10 in the morning for her. And so on a Saturday, she watches the show and she eats breakfast, and it's amazing, right? That I have friends in South Denver who many of our shows, we do weeknight shows, and a 2-hour drive on a weeknight just isn't doable, but logging into Zoom is your own, living room.
Yeah. I love that about it.
Lovely.
Well, just in a reminiscent of a time when we all did gather together, would you tell me a memory that you have of the Texas Storytelling Festival?
I've only been to Texas once. That was not this year when it got sort of cut short, unfortunately, but the year before. I performed in I came, I did a fringe piece there.
Okay.
Which is that moment of, oh, this will be at 9 in the morning, and I'm going first with not maybe what we should have started the 9 in the morning first story slot with, but that's what you picked me to tell, so that's what I'm telling.
Right.
So that was an interesting moment. The piece, and I talked a little bit earlier about, I created a piece for Texas, this mythic realism piece, that I had this idea for a long time about. I also did the Tall Tales. And one of the things that struck me was I have very rarely heard love stories as tall tales. Mostly the tall tale construct is, again, it's a form with a structure. But if you have this idea of a little lie, and then you ratchet up the lie, and then you ratchet up the lie, and you ratchet up the lie, and suddenly we're Bill Lepp somewhere, right? I had this idea of, can you do that with a love story? And so I wrote this piece called Pixie, which is based off a relationship I had in my early 20s, of effectively, what if the manic pixie dream girl actually is just a pixie? What if she in fact has wings? And again, I was drawn to go first. Maybe not the spot that I would have liked that piece to go. It was one of those moments where the entire audience was silent after the piece and then just like roarous laughter. And probably the most interesting thing, and again, I did not expect to win. I was breaking the rules with the piece that I was telling. It definitely it was not what people expected from Tall Tale. It may have checked all the boxes technically, but please try again. But I had a number of audience members almost verbatim say, "Oh my God, why didn't you win?" Like I touched people in a way that is, what I'm after, right? Like the story worked. I think maybe to pat my own back a little bit, like Antonio Hosha was blown away by it. And Antonio is someone that I have incredible and immense respect for.
Yeah.
He is the second of the workshops that I've taken where 3 hours of masterclass with him gave me everything I needed at exactly that point in my storytelling career, where I have to rethink the way I tell every one of my stories, and every story that I've rethought has been a better story from that workshop. And so I have and he was like, that was amazing work. And so it was that moment of like, okay, the story worked.
Yes.
Maybe my venue to tell it in was not the right venue to perform it in.
Yeah, the audience thing.
I'm so glad that story worked.
Well, just to stand in solidarity a little bit with you, I also write original fiction.
Nice.
That I call my 10-gallon Texas tales, which are just, they're basically lies, like ramped up a little bit. And that was one of the things that I, as someone who's very nervous about if people accept what I say or what I don't say, that I came to terms with, that I would be okay if I got huge celebratory applause, but if I also got stunned silence, that was as equally great a reaction. And I was okay with that.
There's a piece that I tell very rarely, which is a Brothers Grimm story called How Children Played at Slaughtering. And in the translation, slaughtering is the strictly speaking is the execution of animals to be turned into food. But it's a story about how a 5-year-old kills another 5-year-old because they're playing. And it's the kind of story that if it works right, at the end of that story, I have heard there is dead silence. And I have heard the memory that comes to mind is someone in the audience went, "Whoa." It's like, yup, that's where we want you.
Yeah.
And that, we have, every one of you is feeling. You may be slightly uncomfortable what you're feeling,
right?
But you are all feeling.
Yeah. So is there a question that you have that you want to answer about yourself as a storyteller, or about stories or your stories?
Sure, I'll get on my soapbox a little bit. I have one soapbox moment that I keep bumping up into. I wrote an article for the NSN's magazine about this a couple of years ago, which is this: what is storytelling? And we talked a little bit about capital S. I will often say capital S trademark storytelling as my sort of shorthand for whoever is currently having an opinion about what storytelling is. And there were two moments that like brought this together, and what was the genesis of this article, which was that the kinder of these moments was there was a storytelling festival produced in Avon, Colorado, which is a very high mountain town here, because someone in town put up a bunch of money and said, "I want a storytelling festival." And they hired a Nashville music producer. They had writers and comedians, and eventually found what we might call storytellers. And in finding our local Boulder Story Slam, which is called Truth Be Told, or was Truth Be Told, is now Boulder Story Slam. Sorry, they changed slightly. They said, "Do you have any traditional storytellers?" And they said, "What's traditional storytelling?" And Johanna, which is the woman that runs it, and is a friend of mine, said, "You should call Cooper." And I had this incredible conversation with this man who had never heard of folk tales. Like, I mean, he knew Disney, but he never heard of folk tales. And the first thing he asked me was, "So you do fiction, right? And fantasy?" And all of my hackles went up. And I realized in retrospect, fiction to me is literary.
Mm-hmm.
Storytelling is performative.
Mm-hmm.
No one calls Shakespeare fantasy. No one calls Tennessee Williams fiction. It's
Mm-hmm.
drama. We assume by its very nature that it is not true. Even plays about historical events are not true. And so I realized I had this whole hackle, and what we ended up with was this incredible discussion about folk music, because he's from Nashville, and we can talk about the evolution of Irish folk music coming in and the development of bluegrass and how that has informed country music. And we had this incredible, like, welcome to the folk process. And by the end of it, I performed at his festival. Like, it was this incredible conversation. And the other moment was there's a story producer in Fort Collins in Colorado who met Anne and I at one point. And he does, it's not quite a story slam, but it's a similar true life confessional style storytelling. And he said to Anne, sort of in blasé passing, "Oh, are you still telling stories other people wrote?" And he's a novelist. And I sort of refrained from screaming in his face, "Do you write novels where you're not the protagonist?" Right? Like, do you do that? So all of this has melded up into this moment that I have heard some of the most respected storytellers offhandedly comment about another art form, whether it was Chautauqua style living history storytelling, whether it's the story slam movement, whether it's theater, whether it's stand-up comedy, whatever it is, right? Where this sort of awkward, like, they don't count. Now, caveat to all of this, I understand that a storytelling festival, you sort of want to, you want people to be, people want to know what they're coming in for. But in all of that, I am more interested in your use of art and your use of words and what you can do to me. I have a good friend who there isn't live lit or performative reading is maybe the right word. Someone that holds a script and reads. David Sedaris is one of the most incredible performers I've ever seen in my life. He stands behind a lectern and he reads. No one can say he's not a performer. But she feels that she will be laughed out if she does that at a storytelling event because storytellers do not read. And so I am far less interested in that's not art. That's not storytelling. That doesn't count. And I'm far more interested in, did you feel something? Did it touch you? Did the art work? Than this arbitrary argument of what counts as storytelling or what counts as art. And so that is my soapbox, and it's a soapbox I've returned to many times.
I love it. Well, thank you for sharing that with me too. I think that's really good because there are lots of definitions with it too. And one of the distinctions I make with the capital S storytelling is that you're doing it in front of an audience. Like you have a listener that you're present with. And so this going online is very well, and this like, okay, how do I reconcile these things?
I mean, my whole experience of online telling, and now there are people that are doing this really well. Donna Washington has like gone all in and it's working. She's had as much, if not more, library gigs this summer than she's had before, but they're all pre-recorded. And she has done it. All of her work is pre-recorded. And that's a choice. In my online telling, I have made the very conscious choice not to pre-record. And I like Zoom meeting, which is what we're in right now, the best because it is the closest thing I can have to seeing people in a room. As an audience member in Zoom meeting, I can direct my eyes. I can look at the whole audience. I can look at just some people. We've had one show that was Zoom bombed. We fixed it. It was a problem, but we fixed it. But there is still those moments. I've had my cat decide to jump over my computer gear in the middle of a really heavy story. There's this moment in that recording of me doing this weird motion where I'm attempting to throw her toy out of the door. In the same way that a drunk can stand up in the middle of a show and start yelling, babies can cry, trains at Jonesboro, right? Like things happen at live shows. And part of my attempt to curate online shows has been attempt to keep a little of that danger, right? That little bit of you can't just go watch the video again.
Mm.
It's live and in the moment. And it's one of the things I love about this art form is that it changes every time the story is told. And I have to say that it's hard not being able to hear the audience react. It's hard not being able to see, except in the little pictures, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is this too much, or are they with me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how long do I hold this moment? People don't laugh the same way online. You get a great joke and someone's like, huh, but you don't get that roaring
Yeah.
laughter that just rolls. And sometimes on stage you have to like pause to let everybody, resolve it, right? Like, you don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
But it struck me just how much I've enjoyed online storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
I've done more shows this summer than I probably did last year.
Wow.
To regularly larger audiences, right? Like, people are hungry. They want, I think more than anything, I think we're going to learn when we get back to live performance is that virtual performance isn't going to go away. It's going
Right.
to be a thing that happens because there are people in New York that want to see you perform. There are people in the Philippines who will tune in at 10 in the morning to watch a show because they're hungry.
Yeah. And they have a
And so,
connection too.
yeah,
So,
like it's beautiful.
yeah, I love that. So here we go. What storyteller or storytellers do you think that I should ask to interview next, and why?
Great. Well, the first person that I would say would be Laura Packer, but you've already interviewed her, so we'll move on. Um,
Okay.
the two people that I would
Well,
recommend
go ahead and tell me why. Or you kind of
no,
have.
no, no. So Laura tells in a way that very few other sort of recognized storytellers tell. She
Mm-hmm.
tells to adults. She tells heavy material. She tells dark material. She reworks folk tales in ways that I've never seen them played with. Um, she tells to adults.
Yeah.
She's not. She cares a great deal for her audience, but she's willing to walk down some really fun, sexy, dark paths that many people who are playing with stories, you can't do that. Well, yes, you can, and she does it really well.
I love her mind.
Um, and Laura is also an incredible friend of mine. She has helped me. She's mentored me. She's great. Um, the next two people that I would offer up are Janice Del Negro and Megan Wells, who are both in the greater Chicago area. They are very different storytellers, but amazing in their own ways. Janice is the grandmother who is just done, and she's glorious in it.
Mm.
She cares so greatly, but she brokers no fools.
Mm.
She plays with fairy tales in a way I just heard her do this incredible version of Snow White from the queen's perspective of, this is the most spoiled girl I have ever met. She does beautiful work, and again is a mentor and good friend of mine. She is someone who has a deep and abiding love of language,
Mm-hmm.
and the and is not overly perhaps poetic in her telling, but her language is deeply thought out. The
Mm-hmm.
way in which the language moves and builds, it's beautiful.
And I was introduced to her on Rachel Ann Harding's Story podcast,
Yeah.
which was, yeah, fabulous.
And then Megan is one of the most performative storytellers I've ever met. And what I mean by that is her training, and she has been a very prominent actress and director in Chicago for many years. But Megan does epic. She does these she has an hour and 20 minutes of the Trojan War from the perspective of Helen. It's called Helen's Troy. It's
Mm-hmm.
stunning. She has a whole piece on Mozart's sister. She has Dracula from the perspective of Mina Harker. She has and she does a great deal of living history characters, and who she's been doing via Zoom. They're incredible. Her scene, like the way she's doing scenery, I'm like, I know that's a corner in your bedroom, but oh my gosh, I saw her do Florence Nightingale, like these incredible historical characters. Megan is and I mean, this is with all respect, she's an incredible actress. She embodies character. She is one of the most stunning performers of long form art that I've seen done. Um,
Mm.
so yeah,
Well,
those
I
are
look
those are the
forward.
two that I
I
would
I
recognize.
hope they all say yes.
I hope they do as well.
Yeah. So I want to thank you, Cooper. Cooper Braun, I really appreciate your time, your energy, your thoughts. When Rachel Ann talked to me about interviewing you, she said you are going to love how he thinks about stories and
Mm.
storytelling. And that was a very true statement. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. This has been really, really fun.
So, my name is Shane Larengo, and today I'm with Cooper Braun. And for all of you listeners, I really appreciate you joining us for the Storyteller Stories series that I've started during the pandemic and which have become these amazing master classes for me to get to sit at the feet of people that expand the knowledge of people I've met and meet brand new people like Cooper. So, thanks again, Cooper.
Thank you so much.